My name is Sam Enright. I co-run this a policy think tank in Ireland called Progress Ireland, where we advise the Irish government on how we think they should be doing policy differently. And I'm very interested in meta science and science policy and economics of innovation and related areas. I have a blog where I often touch on these sort of topics. And I suppose in these things, it's fashionable to say that your guest needs no introduction. Um, but I'll give one anyway, which is that Seemay Chou runs Arcadia Science, and we'll be getting into a lot of detail of what Arcadia Science is. And she also, as far as I understand, is a board member at the Astera Institute and chairperson of the board at the Navigation Fund. She used to be in academia as an associate professor at UCSF, and did her PhD at Berkeley. And I was really happy when Anna put us in touch, given our kind of mutual interest in like systems of science and history of science and like ways that we've been doing engaging these sort of activities, better or worse over time. Um, and one of the particular debates in this area that I think might be like a fun one to start off on is, Seemay, do you have a view on whether science is slowing down? And if science is slowing down, is this something that like has implications for your work, how you think about philanthropy, etc.?
Um, yeah, okay. So yeah, it just really depends on how you measure it. I mean, I think broadly I would say that there's yes, I think like innovative learning in science has slowed down, but not because it inherently has to. I think that that can change. And a lot of that happens, in my view, historically, right before the next technological boom that happens. That we kind of have like the tools that we have for the scientific craft that allows a whole bunch of like, discovery and learning. And then the curve does kind of start slowing down until there's like the next opening of like new ways to measure and look at things, which opens things up again. So I don't think we're like, inherently screwed in this way. I just think it kind of like happens in waves, and we are coming out of a period where there was a little bit of a slowdown there for a bit. That's like, it probably just depends on what data you look at. I'm sure someone can argue the opposite. I'm sure someone can argue exactly what I said, but that's kind of like my experience as a scientist. That's what resonates with me in terms of like what I think is happening. Well, I'm
Yeah,
curious like what other people think. And actually, I would be curious in the room, like who all is like a practicing scientist, versus like someone who's just very interested in the history and the practice of science. Okay, maybe I should do that in a more structured way. Who is like an actively practicing scientist today? Milo. And then, yeah, I'm curious, like what everybody else that's here, like what are some of the things that are driving you to be interested in this conversation?
Should we talk or put it in the chat?
I would love for y'all to talk.
All
Yeah,
right, great.
be good to talk.
I'm a postdoc in biology up the road at Berkeley and LBNL.
Cool.
Uh,
Okay.
and I've been really interested in science communication and the way we convey results to each other for a long time. So I just saw this pop up on Twitter this morning and thought it looked really interesting. And I've been
Cool.
interested in the kind of experiments that folks at Astera and things have been doing in that world for a little while.
Cool. Anyone else?
I'm not a scientist, but I read scientific journal articles all the time, and I have some strong feelings about open access because that's mainly what I can read. It's I think a lot of people who are scientists are hooked up to a university library. They can access all the articles they want to access with no problems, and they don't realize how bad it is outside that uh, walled garden. But like I, I especially also with COVID, I was reading scientific articles about that to get my information instead of relying on the media or like even so-called science journalists. I find very few science journalists who represent anything at all. Like what is actually happening in science. I have a technical background since I was trained as an engineer, so I can actually understand a lot of what I read. And I'm just generally interested.
Cool. Ellen, do you know about this like hashtag I can has PDF trick? I just put it
Yeah,
in.
and I
Okay.
am
Just want to make
aware
sure you, okay.
of Sci-Hub,
Yeah.
and I have sometimes like emailed the authors of articles for their a copy of their paper, which sometimes the only way to get it, but
Yeah.
I wish I didn't have to, right?
Sure. Yes. Yeah. Cool. Thanks.
Yeah, John L. You want to say something?
Hello. Yes.
Hey.
Yeah, I work for medical device manufacturers, but on the regulatory side. So
Oh,
I'm interested in research that happens in private industry and what does or doesn't get shared and how it relates to the careers of the researchers too.
cool. Okay, great. Yeah. No, that's a super important topic that I actually feel like in open science gets doesn't get enough attention, which is like the center of gravity in open science tends to be academia, and so much very interesting, groundbreaking science actually happens in industry, and there's no solution there today, comparatively speaking. So that's great.
Yeah, Anna, you want to say something?
So I'm super interested. I mean, obviously, how funding sources and structures are changing. I think just in the past couple of years, we have seen so many really, really good initiatives. And however tragic COVID obviously was for humanity at large, it did lead to, more motivation, more out of the box thinking when it comes to like quickly solving problems and saving lives. This is very typical in the history of mankind that sometimes you need these big ass tragedies to happen for people to like overcome some of these hurdles in norms and infrastructure in how the whole system works. But I'm
Mm.
equally interested in the cultural hurdles. As somebody mentioned, science communication, like what are the culture, how does the culture war, how do changing or under renegotiation cultural norms affect the very like foundational basic fact-based part of science? People think it kind of doesn't affect it, but it really, really, really does. And I'm so curious about those and how we can, help overcome some of those hurdles.
Mhm.
Yeah, I actually had somewhat of a follow-up to my initial inquiry about whether how you think about whether science is slowing down, Seemay, which is um, I was very interested to follow this like debate in economics over whether ideas are getting harder to find. So if people are not familiar, there was this original paper that was really cool from 2020 from Nicholas Bloom and co-authors, which documented, or they say documented, um, major declines in per person research productivity in science. So the way this has been compensated for is in most cases they looked at was an increasing fraction of the population being researchers. But of course, there's a natural limit on this population if you can't have more than 100% of the population. So it's kind of inevitable that under their model that you would have kind of decreasing returns to science. And there's this like spawned a big debate. There's like a more recent paper by this guy Ando and various co-authors saying that's like wrong for various reasons. But um, the reason why I'm interested in this is like the allegation that the declines in scientific productivity are so large, like often declines by orders of magnitude across different countries and across different fields, that it cannot possibly be explained by like different publishing norms or funding norms, that those things like necessarily have to be these kind of like second order or like somewhat rounding errors compared to uh, compared to this just like general fact of like ideas get harder to find over time, and that will be like the main like first order explanation of scientific productivity over time. But Tyler, I think you had something to say. So,
Yeah, I was just gonna follow up on what everybody else was saying. I'm interested basically in the organization you started and how you got funding and stuff like that. I'm in a slightly different area. I work on medical and clean tech devices, and I'm looking at how to kind of help transition all the research that happens into actual products that can help the world. And then funding that is always a tough area. So that's kind of my interest and why I'm attending, and just to learn from what science you're doing and the amazing organization you're running. So
Cool. Okay, great. Maybe what I can do, Sam, is like follow one thread and then we can come back to, because there's a couple of really interesting threads that probably each deserve a little bit of a dive together. Wesley, your hand is up, and I was actually going to respond to something you put in the chat. So I don't know if you want to like say something before I get into that a bit.
No, it's all right. You should just go ahead and get into it. Yeah.
Okay. I am curious, like, are you a scientist or?
Yeah. I haven't done much academic work for the last like year and a half or so, but before that, I spent about 7 years at the Media Lab at MIT, which
Okay.
itself is like kind of a strange academic structure and with weird funding mechanisms and everything. So I'm just like I'm here because I'm generally interested in those sorts of structures.
Okay, cool. Well, I was going to respond to your comment, Sam, about just like ideas becoming harder to find over time. And I'm certainly not an economist, and I feel like I should start by giving the caveat that I don't even necessarily think of myself as a meta scientist, because I didn't come into the practice of experimenting with how we do science necessarily with the most like scholarly background in it. It started out for me much more practical, and then I've like sort of caught up on a lot of the historical data and lessons and stuff. So a lot of my theories are shaped by a combination of just like what I've experienced and some of those readings. So I'm about to get into like opinion mode. So you can't say I'm wrong because these are just my opinions. But my theory in terms of like whether ideas are getting harder to find is like kind of yes and kind of no. Like, I mean, that certainly seems to be what's happening in practice around me, that it feels like our ability to move in the idea space with like bigger leaps is like becoming more difficult. But I think that is from what I've been like watching around me, is like it just seems like human beings, we are so interested in consensus. We're really interested in building on top of existing knowledge. We don't want to take a lot of risks, and that it kind of makes sense from almost like a sociological perspective, right? So what happens then is like you get more and more constrained over time, where those leaps become scary and scarier is how it feels, because like, and now you reinforce it. I don't want to say the incentives drove that, but the incentives are definitely reinforcing that in terms of like, publishing in journals, committees agreeing with you, advancing in your career. And I do think all of that kind of constrains the idea space that we are able to explore. The information space at the same time feels increasingly enormous, where it's very hard to like synthesize all that information. And I think, like Wesley is saying in the chat, all of this is kind of changing now with AI, where I think it's going to help us both synthesize information, number one, give us a lot more context about the information space we're operating in, where we may be able to like more systematically almost apply like an information theory lens to like, where do we want to go? What do we want to look at to really get more bang for our buck in terms of exploring new ideas? And then the other thing that I think is going to happen is actually we don't have to do it based on intuition, right? Like we can say, and this is actually where I feel like current technologies around AI are going to be extremely limiting. Like if we just use AI to scrape the publication space as a way to generate new hypotheses, we're only going to step a little bit beyond the existing knowledge space, right? If we use data and use that to help us point to completely new directions or ideas that we hadn't even been thinking about, I think that's where some of the really interesting leaps will happen. That will be the real promise of AI to like move us beyond the containment of our current human knowledge and biases. And so I think I agree with basically what Wesley is saying in the chat, which is like, certain constraints are about to get removed, are getting removed right now, that I think is maybe going to inject some new energy into exploring new ideas. And I think there's like a hunger for that too, socially and politically, in a way that I think could be really exciting. Of course, there's always downsides to all of this, but I think in terms of just objectively, like the number of ideas we can explore is about to accelerate. I'm very curious to hear like other people's reaction to that, because I think sometimes it's like hard to talk about this stuff in the scientific community because it just feels like such a unstable time and funding is scary and all of that. But yeah, I'm always just curious to hear people's ideas around this.
Uh, uh, Actually, there's a fourth point maybe that I'd like to add, which is in domains where verifying that some hypothesis is correct, um, like in which the verification is like relatively cheap. You could imagine like there could be a lot of acceleration the AI can like run lots of kind of like virtual experiments, right? No, no, of course, not all science can be done that way, right? But there might be some kinds of science that can be accelerated just through more or less like brute force computation, right?
Yeah, and I think more areas of science are going to be pushed in that direction. Like even biology, I think the biology is gonna about to enter a really interesting era where I'll be very careful how I say it. Please do not take this as like an insult at all, but it's not always as quantitative as we hope it will be because it is so complex that it's like difficult to make it like as quantitative and falsifiable as some other areas like physics. That's not because it's not possible to do that, but we just haven't gotten to a point where we know how to do that. But I think there's going to be increasing pressure on the system and ability to start doing that so that the rigor is going to come more from that type of analysis rather than prestige, which I think is actually great because to me, prestige is just like the laziest way of getting at rigor and all these other signals. And that if you don't have that, and you see in fields where it's more quantitative, like math and physics, it's like a little less of an influence. So yeah, I agree with you, and I'm very excited about that actually. And that's probably the reason why I think that journals as we know them today are ultimately like dead man walking, because they're replacing a thing that is better and we will get better at.
Yeah, I have this uh, fairly specific concern about the use of AI in science that I had written down that I wanted to talk to you about, which is whether LLMs sort of change the calculus for like post-publication review. So one of the many, as far as I know, radical things that Arcadia Science is doing is that the research done there is not published in journals or on preprint servers. And I can see arguments for and against for why a more like post-publication evaluation model would be like more or less appropriate in a world with AI. Like on the negative side, it seems like there's just going to be such a tsunami of like low quality submissions to any sort of outlet, and like it seems pretty appropriate to raise the bar accordingly. On the other hand, it seems like my own ability to like synthesize literatures on different topics and like follow up sources and like chase footnotes and check whether the claimed effect of the paper is like actually what the paper originally reported has been like dramatically enhanced by AI. So it seems like the evaluation ability is also better. So in a way, I feel like confident that this is going to change things one way or the other, but highly unconfident in which direction.
Yeah.
I'm curious if anybody has like strong feelings on this.
Well, I have strong feelings on it, but maybe it'd be nice to hear other people's strong feelings on it before I get in there.
It seems like your feelings might be the strongest of them all.
Let me answer Leslie's question in the chat. So he's just asking me where my organization currently publishes. So you can click on any of the links to our pubs in there, and it's published ultimately on this like open source platform called the Stacks right now. And every pub we do is we do post-publication peer review, which means that we just put it out there as quickly as we can and allow people to comment. Any revisions we make to it are versions, so you can see, and you can find these. They have a DOI, you can find them on their index on Google Scholar. So they fulfill a lot of the same things, but there's no gatekeeper. Actually, the reason AI is definitely a game changer in terms of like it's a ton of technological tailwind to help us come up with more innovative, interesting solutions to solve some of the things you're worried about. But to me, the real reason to do post-publication review is that actually we need to move the way we publish to better match the way science works. And the way science works is that when we put information out in the world, we're making a guess. We never have 100% certainty about anything. There's a wide range from like 0 to 100, but it's never 100. And so the way we publish is as if it's 0 or 100. It passed peer review, so now you have a stamp, so it's out there. So it's binary. It's got this like deterministic feel to it. And that's, something that has gotten worse with time. That's actually not the culture that was around it when we first started doing journal publishing. There's even this study that was done in Science like a few years ago showing that the like hedging words that science use, such as probably, possibly, these things that better match your level of certainty about something have dropped way down. So it means that people are talking with a level of certainty that they don't have, and that helps with promoting science. And so to me, this is actually the most detrimental aspect of the way we publish to how science works, because we don't always know. And what you create is a situation where you create false certainty about something. You don't allow things to go through some other process for rigor, such as validation, testing, reuse, which is the real bar. And then you result, I think, in situations that actually cause like a collapse of like public trust in science, because you've just now created some bar that is impossible to meet of like, I'm correct, I'm a scientist, I'm an expert, you have to believe me, and you're appealing to like authority behind the stamp rather than saying, I'm going to engage and be more honest about our level of certainty. And I think now what's exciting is like when you have more tools like LMs or other things, that we might be able to start attributing some metrics or scores to our level of certainty, especially for like some of the more quantitative areas where there are actual benchmarks, right? Like of like whether or not the model statistically matches the raw data. There's things like this that can start becoming helpful. There are even things, okay, here's a really interesting thing that I've been nerding out on lately, which is there's been a number of groups that have tried to apply AI to like look at all the publications that are out there and forget about whether their claims are correct or not. Do they have enough information, and is the logic clean enough and the methods clear enough that it's falsifiable in theory? And the vast majority of our current publications in the public domain don't pass that test. So we're not even there yet where we can have the more sophisticated argument. I think it would be really cool to start using tools like that of just like, let's just attach a score to like how complete and logically consistent the information is, such that anyone could, in theory, go in and replicate it and validate it. And if it doesn't even pass that bar, we should all be like carrying like a huge grain of salt on like that particular study. And I would love to see the quality of just that metric go up. And I think there's going to be other things like that of evaluating from different perspectives, the rigor of some study or utility of studies. It really depends on like what aspect of it you're most interested in evaluating. But yeah, that's my thought on that. Pre-registering experiments, Wesley's asking in here. I mean, I like the general theory behind it, which is like basically having a mechanism to be really honest and upfront about just like what was your intention, what was your hypothesis in something you're doing. So I like the idea. I'm always a little bit nervous about things that might have just like a super heavy bureaucratic load that's actually difficult to execute on. But I think there's like things people can easily do today, such as like, the way we publish at Arcadia. We tell you exactly what we're thinking, and we publish so frequently. Like we've only been around for like about 4.5 years. We have 100 publications out, and our average team size has been about like 35 to 40. And so that just gives you a sense of like how frequently we're putting out our pieces, not like just when we have a beautiful story, but like just as we go. And that means when you read our stuff, you can see like we're trying to be as honest as we can about what our actual thought process was, including things that didn't work. Okay, sorry, I went off on kind of a few tangents there.
Yeah, I was very surprised when I heard you mention this anecdote about the decline in the frequency of hedging language
Yeah.
in scientific writing. Because one of the people that has influenced my personal writing the most is Steven Pinker, and Pinker has a style guide and some fun talks thereof, in which he talks about like the different purposes of different styles of writing. And he said that the primary purpose of a lot of modern academic writing is to avoid accusations of philosophical naivete, as in like sentences will be phrased in this like really convoluted way, and like lots of use of the word virtually, and all these kind of like kind of
Yeah.
nothing words that wouldn't really be used in everyday speech to like make it so that you're saying something that cannot technically be wrong.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I guess it's maybe I should take a look at whatever paper found this to see what exactly they meant by hedging. But it seemed like um, that kind of more grammatically hedgy or like philosophically hedgy language that is so commonly used today, like disguises people describing what their actual level of uncertainty is. And so it can kind of, yeah, I think maybe they think that it's uh,
Mhm.
expressing
Yeah.
some
Yeah.
level of uncertainty, but like they're not being explicit about it, or like certainly not like labeling probabilities on it, which is a thing I almost never see in papers.
Yeah. Well, one thing I would say as a caveat with the study I just cited, is that I'm fairly certain they did it for like only articles, if not only at Science, at a few journals. So you may see a
Mm,
really different behavior at some of these like glam, really prestige-centric journals as opposed to other kinds of trade journals. But I definitely think like when I read like grant proposals and other things, or when I talk to scientists, like I almost feel like that's our personality to hedge, you know. We like to be
yeah.
extremely careful and precise. Yeah.
It would be funny if there was a kind of Simpsons paradox going on where like the hedginess is declining within organizations and within journals, but increasing at the population as a whole.
Yeah, maybe.
Um,
Yeah, I don't know.
so okay, so I had a uh, fairly specific and structural question for you, which is that Arcadia Science, which we've been talking about, is structured as a for-profit. And I've heard you talk about before lots of good reasons why that makes sense for you and gives a lot of flexibility and stuff. But the other um, projects, organizations you're involved in are nonprofits. And I haven't heard you anywhere say like, what is the reason for that split? So Astera Institute and Navigation Fund, correct me if I'm wrong, are both constituted as nonprofits. So
Mhm.
why the reason for that difference?
I guess like one thing that might be helpful first is just to say that Arcadia, and maybe the order of operations is also important. So Arcadia is like my first baby. Like Arcadia was the very first kind of like meta science experiment I ever started, where we're like, this is our bet of like, there's a particular set of tools in science we're trying to do here, a particular business strategy we're after. And the reason for that is we think there could be some financially sustainable way to think about doing this kind of science outside of academia. That's like a singular, in my view, a singular institutional experiment. And for that singular institutional experiment, it made sense for us to set it up as a for-profit because we were taking that gamble on like what's the right tax structure to this, we think for-profit. Astera Navigation Fund came after and are very different in that we are trying to use those to support a wide range of institutional experiments by ourselves and others, for which, like, it could be nonprofit, it could be for profit. And actually, this is where I think these experiments are interesting to really think about what is the right structure for the particular goals you have and having some flexibility in your thought process around whether it should be for or nonprofit, which should not have anything to do with good versus evil, which is, I mean, honestly, like how some people think about it, you know? And so they just play like completely different functions. A lot of the stuff what we do at Astera is like funding other kinds of experiments, as well as once there are solutions that we learn from these experiments that are useful, we do the work there of like scaling them. So one example of that is like Arcadia was kind of early in saying, okay, fuck journals, we're just going to try this. And then it turned out that it really improved our science. Other people started doing it. We didn't die. Everyone's fine. So therefore, we might want to expand this toolkit for other people to do. So now the platform we use for that, we're expanding and funding the development of through software engineers and others at Arcadia, and it's called the Stacks, which soon we're going to open up for other people to use. So there's just like a slightly different role each of these play in that process, but I think you could think of them as like all tools for thinking about how we both experiment with science and then scale some of those lessons. And I don't think every experiment should be for profit. Like we had a very particular reason to try that for Arcadia.
Yeah, I heard Prachi Avasti, who I think is the chief scientist. I'm not sure the exact title at Arcadia. Describe it as an experiment on multiple fronts, and the concept this brought to mind for me was this argument from Peter Thiel that became pretty influential in Silicon Valley, which is that the failure of companies is a tragedy because it's almost always overdetermined. People like think that they are learning something from the failures of their startups, but very often they're actually not because there's just so many different like interacting reasons why the organization might have failed. That if any one of them had been different by itself, it's very possible the outcome actually would have been the same. And I have this worry about a lot of organizations that are trying to be quite like experimental or visionary along multiple dimensions at the same time. Is like, how would you ever know which of these individual dimensions like is the actual one that made the difference? Like, if for example, Arcadia were to somehow fail entirely or be viewed as a failed experiment, like how would we know which of the individual reasons was the cause of that? Do you see what I'm getting at?
Yeah. There's lots of interdependencies. Yeah, it's a complex experiment. Um, I guess like I worry more about the opposite problem, which is like not so much clarity around failure, but like opportunity around success, where I worry that like for organizations that aren't trying enough different dimensions at once and all radically enough, that you can't really escape like some local minima to actually try something new because of all those interdependencies. So I'm not trying to like discount what you're saying, but I guess I'm just trying to like reflect on like, yeah, where I tend to like be biased in my concerns. Um, I feel like but like in terms of like whether or not we're learning from startup failures though, like I don't know. There's other things that I feel like are just as big of problems that are very solvable. The thing you're talking about is harder. It's like more structural, but they're like just talking about what happened more honestly, it feels like a thing that's free and doable that still most people don't really do. We've actually tried to get like this is now through Astera. We've tried to fund actually a number of startups that were like winding down to go ahead and share like what happened. And seems like a no-brainer if I were in their shoes where we would have like funded the wind down of their teams to like have a longer off ramp. We would have like funded more people to help them write out their lessons and share their science. And in the end, it was, and actually it's even worse in philanthropy and in the nonprofit world, I would say, unfortunately, but like there was a real resistance to doing that it wasn't about money. It was like a combination sometimes of like, I just don't want to think about this anymore. Like I want to move on. It's like, okay, fair. Or like by the time I found out that they were winding down and extended this offer, most of the people doing the technical work were already gone. So like, who's going to write it? Another was like, our investors don't want to. And then another is like, yeah, we don't want to. It just looks bad. Like I don't want to like do anything that might hurt my chances of getting my next job. And so those all things all make sense from a human level, but my point is like there's so much that's lost because of that. That actually I feel like in the long run is like detrimental to even the people involved, right? Because then you don't, to me, my biggest insurance if I fail at something is to show that I understood why and my responsibility in that. Um, and yeah, I worry about this aspect a lot more. I'm not sure what the solution is for the problem you're talking about, but I don't know, maybe there will be better ways to be able to like synthesize that in the future too with different tools. I don't know. I'm like curious
Yeah,
to hear other people's thoughts as well.
yeah. Please. Tony, maybe you want to say a bit more about what you mean by your question.
Oh yeah, sorry, my camera's not working today. But yeah, so I was just browsing the way that Arcadia is publishing. Seems super fascinating. I'm a PhD student at UCSF, by the way. So
Oh, cool.
so yeah. Yeah, I'm right now going to publish a paper and obviously running into all of these run-ins with the editors and the different publishing houses. So I was wondering, how does Arcadia really do your version of peer reviewing before publication into the stack?
Yeah. So we don't, first of all, I would say peer review is not just like one kind of process, right? Like even when I think back to when I was publishing in traditional journals as an academic, like a ton of peer review happened before I ever submitted a draft. Like people read your stuff, you have like committee meetings, you have lab meetings. To me, all of those things are peer review. And so we do all of those things. And to me, like we're trying to de-emphasize that moment of like gating release space on peer review and having it happen after. So we have people comment on our pubs. We've even had examples of people who provided like feedback, real actionable feedback and corrections to some of our things and like hired someone because of that. So what we're trying to do is like have an ongoing dialogue rather than trying to solve this exact problem in the way that you might imagine it, but redefine kind of what it is. Because really, what it is like having feedback and dialogue from as many places as possible to make your science more rigorous. And at the end of the day, and this is kind of like one of my early things that I was so excited about outside of academia is that when you're trying to build a product, um, the bar is extremely high for rigor because you're trying to build something that works. And and so I've said to people in the past, like utility is the highest bar for rigor. And I don't mean that everything in science has to be applied. I just mean that like there is no like rate or test you can put to say like this has to work and it has to work in a human. Like that's actually a really high bar. So I just like think about rigor completely differently now and have like way less emphasis on just this like single process of peer review in my mind. Um, yeah, sorry, I'm trying to catch up in the chat
Yeah,
box.
thank you for that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was gonna say regarding this sort of failure stuff is two of my good friends wrote a post-mortem of their failed startup, and analyzing the reasons why it failed, and this started somewhat of a trend of people similarly like uh, going into a lot of detail about like why particular experiments failed. In the case of my two friends, it had this like weird sort of perverse effect where they got so much like positive press
Mhm.
and attention from posting this that they then like didn't feel like failures anymore for a while, and like it took them a
Yeah.
while, a subsequent period of reflection to realize that they actually had done some things wrong.
Yeah. No,
Wesley, you were going to say something?
go ahead.
Yeah, it's just kind of related to that. In startup land, like with VCs, like it's kind of common. I don't know, like an observation or advice that I guess I wouldn't call advice, but like a VC will say we'll make 10 investments, right, and a third of them will lose money, a third will break even, and then a third will like actually do well. And actually, one of the 10 is like the blockbuster that kind of pays for the entire thing. So failure in the startup community is like it's not a thing that's like shameful at all. and there's it's just kind of like built into the culture that even if you are in a startup that failed, that doesn't really say anything about like the quality of the work, right? And it might have just been like the environment was just not quite right there. I don't
Yeah,
know such
in
a
some ways it's like a really positive signal when I'm like looking for it because it's like,
Mhm.
okay, I don't have to like teach them this. They've like been through trial by fire themselves. Actually, there's someone in the sorry, Merritt, I'm gonna call you out in this session with us. He was at Arcadia for a while. Merritt had done like a couple of different startups before he came to Arcadia. And he was like very unique in this way because when we started Arcadia, it was just a whole bunch of scientists and super green, like academics learning about the whole new world outside of academia. And Merritt was like the one person who had done startups. And I still remember because this had such a profound effect on the team. He gave this talk one day talking about how one of his early startups, I don't know if you would say failed, but y'all decided to bail on it. Like you just decided it was not a good idea. Remember that?
Yeah,
And you like
I would say it failed.
Okay, you say Phil. Yeah, and they like they ended it and gave the remaining money back to the investors, and like the whole room was just like, whoa, like, and but it was like total profound like respect for merit of like, wow, like, and then I feel like after that you had like a glow around you for a while with the team where everyone's like, he's like for real, he's like learned shit, he's been through shit. So I definitely still have that feeling about people, so like I think people who are like super upfront about where things went wrong and are accountable, hold themselves accountable to it, it's like a very positive sign. It's not just a neutral sign.
Yeah. So I also have a failed startup in the past, and I find it funny, like how much benefit I've gotten out of having a failed startup. Like it seems like a significant fraction of the value of having a successful startup, not financially, but in terms of like social prestige and like people taking me seriously as a result
Yeah,
of
yeah,
like
yeah.
having tried at something and failed in the past.
I know it kind of
Um,
gives a different feeling to that phrase, like failing up. Like we can all fail up, actually.
Yeah, yes, there are definitely some perverse incentives. You would certainly be led to believe that by how unlikely my startup was ever to succeed.
Yeah.
Yeah, so there's one popular idea in this meta science world um, of focused research organizations, and there's now about 10 of these um, groups that have been incubated by Convergent Research and Adam Marblestone, including the group that writes the lean programming language for formalizing mathematics proofs. So FROs, as I gather, are like a very popular idea in this space. Are there kind of FRO like elements in what Arcadia is doing? How do you see yourself in response to them? And like, I feel I still don't have a fully clear picture of what they actually are, which is like I'm slightly avoiding saying in this question, but
I know,
maybe you
yeah.
could like share your understanding of that as well.
So I never thought of Arcadia as an FRO, even just by both because of the history of it, but also because of like the fact that it's for profit. So my understanding of FROs is that they're nonprofit startups. And actually, we at Astera funded Adam's first FRO project, which a lot of people don't even know about, which is Rejuvenome. It was a longevity FRO. And so I'm like pretty well versed in just like the evolution of thought around froze. And I think a lot of people still like, what exactly is a fro? There's the original intent of froze was like, what is something that, doesn't isn't meant to exist forever? Is a big project that requires more sort of team-based effort and considerable capital, like not just one R01, to like get in there and execute it well so that it creates some public good tool or data set for the community that can really help lift off. So it's not like a startup in the sense that, oh, this thing is supposed to go on forever. Because like, I mean, startups basically the idea is like you do this seed thing and it expands this in Adam's mind, it's more like a startup because the team dynamics and the leanness and the pace of it is more like a startup. So I feel like it's become beyond that, it's become a bit of a Rorschach test for people of like what they hope it is, for themselves. So it's now funny because at Astera, I get pitched like, I don't know, like a couple froze a week. And as far as I can tell, the one thing that makes them similar is that they're asking me for like 30 to $35 million. And so I think everybody is still kind of trying to figure out what it is, but I think it inspires people because it gives them some kind of a structure to think like what could be some very ambitious thing that doesn't fit in the shape of an academic project that I might be very excited to pursue. And I think time will only tell like how many different forms that takes. I hope it can take on like a more like diverse range of forms, and maybe we don't need to all call it the same thing, because to me that will be the real like success in meta science is like if we can start seeing like a range of different things that are fit for purpose rather than like a singular template.
Yeah, I was reading a post today from my friend Eric Gilliam, who was writing about another scientific structure, this one much more obscure, that he's played some role in popularizing, which he called the BBN, which I think was based on Bolt, Berenk, and Newman, this contractor for DARPA. So every lots of people know about the kind of legendary success stories of DARPA and like funding the existence of all these kind of moonshot research projects and like the early existence of the internet, for example. But not a lot of people know that it was like a lot of the actual execution was done by this kind of contractor organization with a very specific structure. Um, which kind of leads me to like, are there um, examples in the history of science you're like particularly motivated by in your various endeavors? Like you have like the really famous ones like Bell Labs, but like, are there maybe more like specific examples, or like, what do you think is the closest analog from history to what you're trying to do now?
Um, I, yes, and I feel like the answer is a little bit like if you're gonna stay for this answer, you have to stay for the whole answer. So then you go off and quote me and say something I didn't mean. But late, like I've been thinking actually a lot about Palantir. I think Palantir, if you don't know that much about Palantir from a technical perspective, is a very interesting model that I think we might see more forms of it in science and have started to. And so I actually didn't know that much about Palantir until like in more recent years. But I will do my best to try and summarize it in case. Yeah, that's a really good post on it actually. But the TLDR, in case you're not familiar with Palantir, is you probably think of it as just like, a defense organization, and may or may not have positive thoughts about it. But if you look under the hood, technically what they did was they really went in and they helped companies rethink their data streams, how they analyze the data, and the entire operating framework around that analysis. And of course, in their case, it was applied to thinking about defense and surveillance. But it's a really interesting model because like that's just not typically what most businesses do. They don't go in there and like piece by piece like rebuild the entire operating framework of some other company and basically tell them how to deal with data. And it's like software, it's a whole bunch of different things at once. It's not like a singular like punchy product. And at that time there weren't that many examples of that. And so it's almost like just saying like here's a new way of doing things with your data. And I think that's really interesting how they went about that. And they definitely played the like way longer game, right? That took them like a decade to really like get better at that. And they sent engineers in to like understand things. Like, I think that might be something for us to think about now for science that, basically we need to like go in and rethink many, many different aspects of the way we do science. Sure, you can try and upgrade one aspect, like use a robot for this piece or whatever. But like there's going to be more opportunities to think way more holistically because a lot of the parts of the like scientific cycle are very interconnected and iterative, that I think more and more groups should start thinking about like lots of different nodes they could be thinking about and how to like re-architect information flow and how that connects with like experiments in the lab. And that's like a very different and much longer game to be playing. And so, yeah, I think that's something I think about a lot. So it's not really like another meta science experiment, but I think, it was an experiment in its own way. Like it was very radical. And I think a lot of people didn't believe it could ever work. And, they made it work. Of course, there's some specifics about Palantir and that market, of course, that may not necessarily apply to science. But yeah, that's probably the thing that I've been thinking about more lately is like past businesses that have really broken into completely new modes and markets, and lessons we can learn from that.
Yeah, in that post, Nabil Qureshi talks about working at Palantir with Airbus and sort of like improving a lot of their like engineering flow and process and stuff. It sounded like a kind of um, more constructive and technical version of consulting. But at least that
Yeah, it's like
particular anecdote.
I think like at face value, it starts out almost like consulting, but it's really that's the entry point towards like an engineering project, a very innovative and iterative engineering project for each of their customers, right? And I think for us at Arcadia, like I've been thinking about this a bit more too. Merritt, you've worked with us, like we're working on so many different workflows in science. It's not like one magic bullet for us. It's not like one piece of software. It's like thinking about how you structure biological data with evolution and what the implications of that are for like data flow analyses, all these things. It's much more insidious than like a single tool. And I think that deserves like, yeah, different thinking about timelines and people and strategies for improving and implementation.
Are there further thoughts on this topic? Because if not, I want
I
to.
think like coming back to the academia side of it, I guess a little bit in like the post publication peer review. I feel like there's a place for that kind of work in that where it's like actually thinking about, okay, during this project, what were your systems? Like how could these systems have been improved? And can we take what the data you've produced and put it into a format where now it's more explorable and accessible and like interpretable. And so
Yeah.
I think there is, to go back to that publication stuff, I think there's a way to like try to have some like philosophy of work driven things that come into that don't really exist in like traditional peer review, which is more like evaluative.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, sometimes like the way I think about it is like, I want to be found by my future self, and I want my future self to be like interested in what I did. And my future self is definitely not going to be sitting there always reading manually everything. I want to be as much in the information space and be discoverable in that way as I can. And the cool thing is that like now you can do that. Like it used to be like when I was a grad student, there's no way anyone is going to read your like lab notebook or your notes. But today it's possible. So like why wouldn't I be putting myself out there as much as I can? And so I think that's actually really exciting, especially when I think back to earlier in my career when it's just like, I mean, it's really stressful if you feel like your career is dependent on everything working. And that is just not how science works, especially if you're not doing like really ambitious science, right? It is just inherently shooting for things where it's a high failure rate. And I think that should be good. So if we can actually put all that stuff out there in a truthful, meaningful way and it start making it count, right? Then the whole framing of it changes where we can just think about progress in this way as opposed to winning. And so, yeah, I mean, I think I don't know, like for those who are like postdoc or in grad school, like how you feel about just starting to like work like this, like I mean, there's nothing really stopping you. Um, Even if you wanted to play the like journal game, you could still work like this, for the most part, I think.
Yeah, I think there's like various levels of it of like how discoverable can you make your data and your work, and or other people's data and other people's work.
Yeah.
But I think it's a cool place to like think about how something like peer review, maybe it's not peer review, could like add a ton of value rather than be evaluative.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I mean, the other thing I think about, and now we're like thinking about more and more as a company, is just like, what are the direct benefits to us? You know, like, okay, sure, there's an altruistic argument, which I believe in, but there also is a selfish argument, which is helpful for scaling anything, which is like, you know, the more comprehensive and rigorous we are about our basically our documentation stack, right? The more we can actually pick up on patterns and opportunities and talent that we wouldn't otherwise. And so now, like, you know, we do all of our stuff on Notion, and there's so many great tools now where we can like literally search all of our documentation. We can pick up on ideas. We can pick up on like, oh, this, it might be time to publish this, or like institutional knowledge can like live on in a way that's only going to get more and more interesting. And we've even had like a few other, you know, folks outside the organization, other companies like interested in seeing how we've set this up, which for us, it was originally like how we expedite as much as possible and improve our publishing workflows. That was like 5 years ago, right? Now it's like, oh my gosh, with this AI tailwind, it's like, oh my, they like we've actually set up the most like rigorous, comprehensive like knowledge stack that a lot of companies don't even think about, and then they like lose information. It's really inefficient. It's like leaky. And so, yeah, I think that there's like benefits all around, even if you weren't being altruistic at all, you know?
Super cool.
I'm finding it to be a more and more common experience that I ask an LLM such a specific question that its answer somehow references me. I don't know if this is a sign that my interests are too narrow, or that my past self did a relatively good job, like documenting his interests and aspirations.
That's funny. Yeah,
So
maybe I should try and do that on purpose, see if I'm doing a good enough job getting myself out there.
um, yeah, so there, I did want to talk to you about some more directly biology related stuff while we were on this call, including that it seems that one of the running themes in some of the projects that you've worked on is the study of non-model organisms. And as a economist, I'm like interested in like what are the incentives here. So as I understand it, like a lot of natural science research is dominated by a relatively small number of like model organisms that are incredibly useful for like kind of calibrating and standardizing results against. So we get innumerably many papers about E. coli or C. elegans, the famous worm with the 302 neurons. And on the one hand, it seemed like, so it, from what I understood, you had a previous startup called Trove that was involved in studying some properties and potential applications of a of ticks, which are an example of one such non-model organism. So is the idea here that like scientists are too incentivized to study model organisms, where there's like not research benefits, or there's not like the proper infrastructure in place to study like ones that are not in that kind of canon? Is the idea that there's been so much contingency in this choice of which model organisms are the good ones, and we could do a better job now with the information we have on like choosing a different set to calibrate against? Like, what is the theory exactly of like what kind of alpha you get by doing research about this?
Yeah. So I would say like my answer to that has like evolved over time. When I first started Arcadia, the idea behind moving beyond traditional organisms is that like biology is just so vast. Like we are just looking under a few lampposts, and the amount of like novelty and information you can gain by just looking under a slightly different lamppost is huge. And there's a lot of practical barriers to that, such as lack of tools, the amount of time it takes for that, the lack of community around whole new species, just it's riskier in that way, in very practical ways. And yeah, so so I still believe all those things. And then I feel like I've like learned more things like since, which is that I think my original thinking around is like, okay, let's like create an environment where people are enabled and incentivized to look in new places. And so we spent like the first few months like, okay, which places like $500 million actually doesn't take you that far. Like in the grand scheme of things, you got like a decade, right? Developing an organism takes a long time. So like which three new organisms basically are you going to choose? That was both like a really stressful question to confront, as well as like there's not a great answer for that because there's literally like millions of species. Like, how are you going to decide, And so what we ended up start thinking about is like, actually, what if that is the central question? Like, how do we decide? Like, what are the data-driven ways that knowing everything we know today, if it's not just like historical precedents, tools, practical considerations like this, if we were to actually zoom way out and look at the data, how would we decide on the basis of data? Like, where are the most interesting places that can unlock the most new information? Or where are the most interesting organisms that are actually way better models for this particular corner of biology I'm trying to study? And there's actually like potentially very quantitative answers to those questions that can break us past human bias. And so that's kind of what we've been thinking about. And that's really where a lot of our like workflows and data analysis have been going, is just like, what are the sort of computational criteria for answering these different things? And it's really helpful that we constrain sort of our business model down to therapeutics and thinking about specific diseases where we know something about the genetic and molecular determinants of them to start mapping that out. So we've like gone almost like full circle, because when I started, I was like, we're not doing model organisms. We're not even doing models. We're looking for novelty. And we've come all the way back around to say, actually, like we're interested in the algorithms that help you decide this, which can answer on both sides, including what are the best models. And so what we have found is that like, with a lot of our workflows, and if y'all want to look on our pubs, we have a bunch of stuff around picking organisms. Like what's the rational, mathematical, statistical framework for picking an organism? And you can actually see a lot of examples where mouse does okay. And then there's some examples where mouse does really poorly. And that matches with like historical clinical trial data where it did not work because of some fundamental difference in the biology that we now know today. And so to me, this is now why I'm like doing this. It's really three things. It's like novelty, like how do we get more innovation from biology by exploring a wider swath of it? It's efficiency, which is like, how do you do that in a less random way by using data? And it's accuracy. Like, how do we actually use statistical frameworks to make the right choices for rigor, and especially when you're modeling disease, I think that makes a lot of sense. So I think you asked something of like, yeah, would we pick a different canon of organisms or something? Actually, I would. So based on everything that we've seen, if your only goal, and I'm not saying this is the only goal, but if your only goal was to model human disease and you were to pick, let's say, a new 6 canon set of organisms, it would not be all the same ones we have today, actually, based on our data. There's one that survives quite well, which is mouse actually survives. Zebrafish survives. Zebrafish does really well. And then there's some other things that emerge that you're like, what the hell? So one is chlorella. It's like a single-celled algae. And for a number of reasons, like it has actually tiles like a really wide space of human genes that is extremely well conserved for and a good model for. And so like really the goal in my mind, if it were up to me, which it's not, but if I were to choose like a new canon, I would say, what's the 5 or 6 that uniquely tiles the most different spaces of human biology, such that we like cover the most space most efficiently? And it would be a different set of organisms that we're using today, which is, I just want to make very clear, I'm not saying we shouldn't study other organisms, but depending on the goal that you're after and how you might think about the solution for that, I think with the right data and analyses, you might be able to like come up with like an answer that breaks some of your own assumptions. And that would be really interesting to test, which is kind of some of the work that we're doing now.
There was this article in Asimov Press about the rates of mutation among model organisms. And I haven't looked into this in a large amount of detail, but I remember there being some arguments about like whether the model organisms even really were model organisms, in that the rates of mutation over such long time periods had been like systemically underestimated. In which case, like you're kind of screwed either way. Like you need to pick like new that gives even more reason to like study new organisms.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, especially if you're working with bacteria, you definitely want to sequence your bug before you start.
yeah. Any further thoughts on this? Anything else? So I had a confusion that I was running into in my day job recently, and I've been asking people who work in um, startups and who work at like the intersection of academia and private industry to try to shed some light on it, which is we have all of these estimates from economics about what the social rates of return from science funding are, and they're often extraordinarily high. There is a pretty strong consensus in the economics of innovation that public funding for science is underfunded, and that it's like one of the highest general return categories, return on investment of that funding. And it's actually not unusual to find papers that estimate the altruistic rate of return at something like 60% per year of putting in an investment into science. So you have that line of evidence on the one hand, and then you have another line of evidence, which is the rates of spin-out formation. So I did some work on national spin-out policy and was consulting with various people in government about this. And a country like Ireland produces like 25 spin-outs per year for the entire country. And that number seems very low to me, but that is actually pretty much the best conversion rate in the world in terms of dollars or euros of public subsidy towards science being converted into like flow through startup companies. And I'm confused that more people are not confused about this, in that you seem to have very small numbers of discoveries getting directly commercialized by academia. You have seemingly not even that much demand to like change the policies around this, where it's not like investors are like foaming at the mouth to try to like find out about discoveries as soon as they happen in academia. And so it seems like the most parsimonious explanation for that is actually that like a lot of academic research is relatively low value, or doesn't have nearly as high social rate of return. And I just like do not know how to square these two lines of evidence. Like on the one hand, you could say, and this is usually the response that I get, is that like publicly funded science is like more upstream of commercialization. It's like this really like theoretical blue sky stuff that does not come to fruition necessarily, possibly until after decades. But I think there's actually also a big line of research evidence about that from like history of science and like other fields, which indicates that's like not in general true. Most scientific research actually has like not that long, like not actually that much longer timelines compared to a lot of commercial stuff. And there are certainly examples of extremely long-term timelines, but they're somewhat exceptional. So I just remain like highly confused about this area, and I'm also confused that more people are not confused.
I'm curious to hear other people's. Does anyone else have thoughts on this? I have some thoughts.
Yes, Ellen, this was my recommendation, is that professors should be allowed to keep the patents on things that they invent. But I think that the numbers are kind of suspiciously small, even accounting for that. But yeah, you're going to say something?
I think so. I do have thoughts on this. Like I I went to school at the University of Waterloo, and it it's an unusual university in Canada in that it does allow professors and grad students and undergraduate students to keep their intellectual property. I think for professors and grad students, it's a little bit more complicated, but you can still be like a professor and make a spin-off company if you want. And but most Canadian universities are not like that. That's not what their policy is. They're not even thinking about whether they would have spin-offs. I think there's also a bit of like aside from that, there if you're a professor and you're thinking about how do I move the needle on human knowledge just a little bit farther from like what our civilization knows in a particular direction, that's like you're thinking about a different type of problem than usually the type of problem that is actually easily commercialized. Like if you're trying to like advance the human understanding in some subject, that's not really where all like the profitable ideas are at. That's you kind of have to think a different way to be like, oh, this is something that we actually know how to do. We just need to actually kind of work out the details of and product market fit and all of that. And it's like a different thing, and it's a different type of idea. Um, like when I get excited about science and I kind of think about what would I want to work on if I was actually doing science, I think about kind of some of the bigger ideas that like maybe advance human understanding, but it's not like, I don't know, manufacturing diapers to help people with their I don't know, like it, you have to uh if you want someone to spend the time on doing the work to make a company, it's a very different mindset, I think, than if you actually are going to try to succeed in academia. I mean, aside from all like the journal stuff and incentives and funding and all of that, but just like what type of problems do you want to think about? What type of problems do you want to work on? What sort of activities do you want to do? There's like I think there's a Venn diagram with a certain amount of overlap between those two types of ideas, but it's not like a lot of them are different.
Yeah, Tyler, you see that?
Yeah, I just wanted to say I think the incentives aren't always there, especially for academia. I have a good friend who's a professor, um, was at CU Boulder, now works in Switzerland, but invented a water filtration system that was kind of groundbreaking. And he was like, "Great, I publish on it. That's what I get paid to do, and I'm going to move on." Luckily, one of his grad students started a company around it, and now it's going to be the next NASA water filtration system for the Artemis mission. So it's like the incentive just wasn't there, and luckily the grad student was like, "Hey, I have an interest in this. Can I pursue it?" Um, and also at CU Boulder, there's a ton of they're finally seeing the need for this. So they have a ton of support from the business side to funding to licensing, all that stuff. Um, and have been putting a lot of energy into that the last 10 years. And I think it was either 2024 or 2025, they had the most amount of startups of any university in the country, which shocked me for the like MITs and all the other universities out there that are known for that. But yeah, I think the incentive for the professors at least just isn't there. And then the support for money and funding and all that is also not there. And I think kind of having a better system around that. And I think Eric Gilliam wrote something on this where it's like if you look into more deep tech funding, because that's what a lot of it is, it's not going to instantly be $1 billion company because it's not a software company. But if you look at it in a different lens, there's a way of funding it and making it happen. And that's what he was trying to, I think, get across in his article.
Yeah, Sam, I guess like my thought is like anytime there's a problem like this that's so confusing, it's probably because like there's not one reason. There's like many reasons, you know? And I think all these things are being said are true. I think there's lots of reasons in addition to that. I'll focus on maybe the things that like I had the most direct experience around. One was like, um, I, my university made it really tough. Like UCSF did not make it easy. They added all this like random friction into the deal making that it was just like, well, there is no arguing for a giant piece of the pie before there's a pie. Like you can have a giant piece of a zero pie, or you can like reduce friction. And, you know, this is why I think like equity makes a lot of sense. I'm surprised that more institutes don't think about equity. I also think that like IP creates this like really weird bottleneck, even though at the end of the day, like I feel like IP isn't as powerful as people even realize. Like there's so many ways to break IP. IP is pretty fragile, especially for whatever just came out in academia. It's probably going to have to go through many, many more rounds and it's so breakable. But really a lot of like companies and investors are just they don't want to like engage in a legal fight with the university later, so they're happy to like pay it. Um, and so like I feel like I had to like learn all this. The reason it ended up being easy for me is I was like, well, like I really just want to like do this and I'm not so married to academia that I'm gonna engage more in this. So I just basically like published everything that I learned. I was like kind of like screw IP, whatever. I'm just gonna publish it. Anyone can work on this, including me. And then I left and just like removed all the friction for myself and just took that risk. But what that meant was like I left the university, you know, it's like there's not an easy arrow back. So if you're someone who maybe is like worried about losing your career in academia, it's a pretty tough choice because it feels like a one-way irreversible choice. And I think that's also to the detriment in another way where we don't have a lot of people who have ever had experience building products going back into academia to think a little bit differently about the science we do. And that doesn't even necessarily have to sacrifice like innovation or freedom from the like sort of direct market influences. It's just like just having some awareness. Like I feel like if I were to go back and start my lab at UCSF again today, I would be thinking about a different set of questions that were still very fundamental and probably within the subset of a list that I had like considered before. So like not totally outside that Venn diagram, but more shaped by like what I realize is like useful information to have that feels a little more actionable and useful in the world. And then I think the other thing that I've like learned is just how much of the work that's published doesn't replicate. To the degree I maybe won't say the name of the like venture fund, but they a really eye-opening experience I had coming out was like, you know, I basically looked at like a bunch of financial models of like all different venture funds, company creation studios, and whatever to try and think about Arcadia's. And several came back and were like, you're going to have to budget in preparation for the fact that about 75% of any academic work that you want to follow up on is not going to replicate. And so just assume that going in, which is kind of like a crazy stat to hear as an academic at the time, because I was like, wait a minute. And I think that was the first time I realized like, oh, the value of a lot of academic science is like we generate interesting hypotheses. And there's evidence to make those hypotheses worth following up on and informed, but they're not like a done deal. And I would not be surprised, you know, and I put a lot of like work into the research that I did, but like, you know, it's partial information. Like I could have been wrong about some things. And so I think it's on a journey, right? And so like I think that we sometimes forget that. And so I don't think it's necessarily like shitty science. It's just like at an early stage of like its journey, you know? Um, and so I think, yeah, I think that's why a lot of early startups fail, and I think that's fine, but like we should make it easier for people to do that. You know, if 90% fail and if you leave academia to do it, you're like out of a job. That's pretty shitty. And then we don't have exchange of like thinking and mindsets. Like I would love to see more entrepreneurs go back to academia. And that's actually also an area that I've been really trying to target at Astera is like I'm always very interested in finding those like magical people who are scientists who did some startup or product building or something, and now they want to go back to the sandbox to do some basic science, but they don't quite know where to go to do that. Like that is like my favorite thing to fund. because I think we need like a lot more of that mixing. I don't know if that's what froze are for. That's a good question. I think it depends on who you ask. Like, um, I think sometimes it solves that problem, Chris, and then sometimes it's going in the other direction. I don't think we've had froze around long enough to see the back and forth, you know? But that would be great, you know, like if the more that gets normalized. I mean, that's one of the things that Adam and I talked about early on when he was first thinking about froze and I was working on Arcadia is just like, look, it benefits basically everybody in the science ecosystem to have more of these because you have a more robust job marketplace for basic science that isn't monopolized by one type of institution. And it feels like there can be, yeah, just like de-risking of that so that more people try. Because when you look at in like the biotech space, people aren't worried that if they go into this company, it's their last job ever, or that they can never, you know, it's just like there's more moving around in a healthy way that I think is very good, actually.
Yeah. One of the things that I mentioned at the outset with Anna was the grants program Emergent Ventures, which is run by Tyler Cowan, and is the reason why she and I know each other. Like, do you have a view on the kind of explosion and like proliferation of these grants programs, and like what precise problem larger organizations can solve that are not just solved by these grants? Like, what problem would Arcadia be solving that wouldn't be solved by like Emergent Ventures scaled up by a factor of 100?
I think like the biggest edge we have is our time horizon. Like that's how I think about the kinds of problems. It's not like team size. It's like how long can we iterate at a thing so that we don't settle too early. Um, I think settling earlier for us would have looked like picking some organisms that we just like go ahead and plant our flag and start doing stuff in that area and start trying to spin out things from that or something. And we really held out for a long time, just trying to figure out like, wait, something about this isn't right. Like, what are all these other things that we might want to be doing and like workflows and data sets and other things. So to me, that's the real opportunity if you have like a lot more funding is to actually make it easier for yourself to be nimble and pivot for longer. So that you can fundamentally go into a different space than other people are able to do. We've done a lot of pivoting, as Merritt knows, at Arcadia. It's not for the weak. It's like Merritt's tired, probably. He left us. He had enough.
Yeah, I find I mean I and a lot of my friends have like personally benefited from these grants programs, but I feel they are prone to a lot of kind of like paddishness and like uh funding research is kind of like interesting for a while and then like people stop talking about it and there's like no real security or like long-term pipeline or something for people thinking of this.
Yeah.
Um yeah, okay, I think we only have 1 minute left in this call, but um do people have final concluding thoughts, questions for Seemay? Thank you all so very much for coming.
Yeah, thank you guys.